Well, we'll
Yeah,
go ahead and
good
get
time.
started if that's all right with folks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Michigan Political Science Association annual meeting and our roundtable on teaching innovations in a post-pandemic world, or we hope maybe post-pandemic. I'm Marty Jordan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Michigan State University, and I'm a member of the MIPSA Executive Board. The Michigan Political Science Association is one of the oldest continuously active organizations in our discipline. And this year's conference is MIPSA's 53rd and our second one to be held virtually. Hopefully we'll be back in person next year. And this panel is being recorded just to let everyone know, and will be posted on the MIPSA website at a later date. So you may wish to keep your camera on or off, but I do encourage you to try to stay muted unless you have a question for the roundtable panelists. And speaking of our roundtable panelists, they include today Cherie Strachan, a professor from Virginia Commonwealth University, but previously at Central Michigan University. And she's, written extensensively on pedagogical innovations and experiential learning, among many other important topics.
My name is Takitaki. I'm a political scientist at Ferris State University. Get over to Cherie and we can just roll down the line.
Hi, it's Cherie. Previously at Central Michigan University, and I just moved this fall to Virginia Commonwealth University in an administrative position, community engagement position. So here I am.
Hi, I'm Shu. This is my first semester at Eastern Michigan University. Previously, I was a colleague with Marty at MSU.
And thank you all three for introducing yourselves as my Zoom cut out. I was complaining previously to Cherie about sort of the poor connection sometimes in my office. So apologies for that. And thank you to my incredible colleagues for stepping up. I just want to say that I invited all three because they're exceptional teachers who are committed to their students, to the craft of teaching, and they frequently employ innovations in their classrooms to meet students' diverse learning needs. And I just want to acknowledge how challenging these past couple of years have been for our students and for us as educators. So I really think that this topic is timely and incredibly important. And I'm so grateful to all of our audience members for showing up today. I wasn't sure on a Friday afternoon, sort of the last panel of the day, how that might be, but many thanks for being here. It looks like maybe I cut out again.
Just real quick. You're good.
Good. All right. Well, if it's okay with folks, I'll just go ahead and start by starting out with some questions for our roundtable panelists. But my hope is that we can sort of have more conversations about teaching in higher education, some of the challenges perhaps that our students and us face, and maybe discuss some strategies or innovations that might work. So feel free, though, as members of the audience, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat for our panelists. So I just sort of wanted to, as we sort of look back, I think sometimes planning for the future is helpful by starting to look backwards. And so I sort of just wanted to hear from our roundtable members about, if we looked back at the past sort of academic year, which was almost spent entirely online, what are some of the tips that you have for course design, in particular for a virtual format that you used or that you think other instructors might benefit from for a similar modality? We're not out of the woods yet for COVID. And so I, fear that we may have to return to remote learning in some way. So, maybe some of the tips you have could help us also quickly transition to an online format if we're teaching in person this semester.
Do you have a preference for how we go through these? No?
Go for it.
All right. Well, I started, so I'll start. I don't know if I have recommendations for how to do it quickly necessarily. I think it's always a struggle, especially the way that it happened at the beginning of the pandemic, where we were all, expecting to be face-to-face and shifting over. I'm doing some focus groups right now with Rebecca Glazier on this topic on pandemic teaching for APSA. It was a small special projects grant. And one of the things that, people are reiterating across the focus groups is that it gave them a chance to sort of prioritize, right? Like, okay, what are the core things that I want my students to learn? What is superficial? What is essential? And it really did help them sort of reflect on substantive content and prioritize. So I think, maybe don't try to do everything, do the things that are essential or that are core or that are important. One person did a reflective process where they said, what are my students going to remember 5 years from now? Like, what do I want them to know and remember 5 years from now? And if those are some core analytical skills, maybe that's more important than covering all the substantive content that helped them feel better about not being as, maybe comprehensive as they had been. Another interesting point, I think, that's come up for other people and also for myself is to think about the substantive content that you're teaching and the modality that you're teaching. Like if you really have to do an asynchronous class, like for some sort of requirement for the administration or to check boxes, it's probably easier to do intro classes that are very sort of concept heavy, like descriptive information heavy, where there's a lot of help from the textbook and from the publisher for content that you can use in an asynchronous format. And then to save the asynchronous for things that, that require more interaction or web breakout rooms or something. And also something to think about too, is I've had several people in the focus groups from different courses, but courses that had sensitive content say they absolutely would not allow it to be recorded, right? They didn't want to teach like a gender and politics class or about civil rights or, some of the contentious things and have those things either for themselves recorded as content that would be spread and taken out of context, but in particular, the conversations that students needed to have that were nuanced. So thinking about the way the substantive content interacts with the modality can be important. And then I, on a side note, have been really careful about making recordings and how I make them accessible. And I sometimes don't always use the Blackboard shell the way, the Panopto and the things, because I do have concerns about some of the things that I'm teaching and intellectual property. And so sometimes I've used YouTube videos and shared links. If it was something that was my own that I'm writing about, or something that was my own that I didn't want to get the university to have embedded in something that they could say then was theirs if it wasn't clear. So just being thoughtful about what your university policies are, about what your own concerns are, as we get so accustomed to sharing more and more information online, is that it's still, it's still your intellectual property. It's still your syllabus. It's still your lecture. And to think about those sorts of things too, in addition to just jumping in as quick as you can. So. Who should we pass it off to? David, to my right? Yeah.
I was going to let you go first if she had something she wanted to jump in first.
Oh, well, thank you. No, I think, thank you, Cherie, for sharing that. I think the intellectual property issue wasn't something that I always thought about, and I don't think I think about it until you mention it, until you articulate it in such a way. So thank you for sharing that. I'll be more mindful of it, both for my own lecture and how I use YouTube videos for illustrations in my lectures now that those are online. So I just want to quickly add that for me, my semester here at Eastern, I'm teaching both synchronous and asynchronous. So I think it's definitely a lot of investment upfront to develop a asynchronous course, but I was sort of on the fence whether or not I want to go with that modality. But after I start doing it, I think it definitely has the potential. Well, it definitely is one of the flexible modalities. If things went south in terms of something that's easily accessible for students. And I also think it's a useful tool for some untraditional students, like the ones at Eastern, where they have responsibilities outside of the classroom. They have to take care of, they have dependents, they have a full-time job. And I definitely think that's more convenient for those kind of students whose schedules are not as flexible. And I was also wondering if that could be used as a foundation for this teaching technique called the flipped classroom. So I just want to throw it out there in case someone has, and then flip the classroom is something that I'm currently learning. So if we have the time and willingness to discuss that, that would also be something that I would love to learn and hear from you.
Sure. And then I'll jump in. One of the things that I went through in the very beginning of the pandemic was trying to kind of future cast what happens if I'm taken out of the game for a month, right? Or, I know that my department consists of, one other political scientist. And at the time we were going into the beginning of COVID, she already had a full load. There wasn't a lot of anybody else who could pick things up. And I had, students who were seniors who needed these courses to, move on with their careers. And I was very concerned that if something were to happen to me or to one of my colleagues, it could throw a monkey wrench in their plans. And I didn't want to be responsible for that, or at least I wanted to try to find some way to ensure that I could, continue serving them in the capacity that they needed from me as an educator. And so I went through, and I've been teaching both synchronously and asynchronously online for a while. And I built asynchronous shells for every course that I was going to be teaching, with the full knowledge that I was going to use them in a synchronous fashion or in combination with physical meeting spaces. And that process was actually really illuminative to what I was trying to accomplish in those elements. Cherie mentioned that, tapping into YouTube and some other things. I found myself regularly going to sources I was familiar with, speakers from TED Talks or conferences, and then trying to find a way. I'm like, okay, what do I want to take from that and compartmentalize that I could then, deliver in a lecture to my students? And I probably recorded, 40 or 50 hours worth of lecture over the summer, kind of getting ready, until I realized that at the end of the day, some of my best work wasn't as good as the people who I was watching and taking notes from. And I kind of had to give myself permission to get out of the middle and let the students get it from where I was getting it from, right? And that's can be kind of a humbling experience and a little bit of a doubt check, right? Am I doing my job at that point? But by curating that material, by selecting it and building into those asynchronous courses, and then knowing that I could, in a synchronous fashion or in a face-to-face, design active learning activities and engage with them on those topics, both now coming at that material having watched the same kind of things. It gave me permission in a lot better kind of a mindset to build a course where I could be additive, but I didn't feel like I needed to be this filter between them and other really, really good information. And that's been really successful thus far. One of the other benefits that I've had is that after about a week of deliberations, both my department and to a great extent our provost and dean gave us pretty wide latitude as to how we were going to conduct our classes this semester, knowing that we were going to see regular disruptions from the pandemic, and we have. That gave me the ability to structure my in-person classes in a way that when it came down to it, I had the ability to move them online, either into an asynchronous or a synchronous format. And I had to get over my anxiety about doing so for a brief moment. Obviously, one of the things Ferris was priding itself on is the idea of returning to the in-class experience on campus, that it didn't have to be perfect. Right? They were looking for that connection, some of that face-to-face time. But the idea that it needed to be an everyday in class like nothing was different wasn't what they were looking for. And that realization and taking the time to accept that was also a big change in the methodologies that I was using to try to present this information. So just a few thoughts from me, and I think I'll turn it back over to Marty to guide us elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you all for those comments. And thank you, David, for the reminder that humility is a key aspect of being a good teacher, right? And so sometimes removing ourselves from the equation is the most beneficial for our students. I think I'll just add to those sort of comments a couple of other things, is that I know that for me, moving from an in-person course design to an online course design, thinking about things in a module sort of format, right? So breaking things up into modules. That way, if I got COVID and needed to be excused from the classroom, right, it wouldn't be perhaps the end of the world. Someone could maybe step in my place, or maybe I could plan ahead so that the modules would be in place. But it's really for students. If they needed 2 weeks off, like them missing one module wouldn't be the end of the class for them, right? And so thinking critically, and actually now that I've done it for my online courses, when I taught, synchronously online or asynchronously online, I actually now design everything in a module format, even my in-person courses, because I think it just helps students structure better their understanding of the material. And so we sort of put it into those blocks for them. And so I've moved from, for example, even midterm exam and a final exam, but breaking up those assessments and giving more assessments on a more regular basis. And students seem to actually appreciate that. 3 exams or tests in a semester or 4, even research shows is far better for students and their engagement with the material and retention of it. So I just make that comment. And the final thing is like the human moments still matter, right? The humanization. And so connecting. So even if you have an asynchronous class, like just doing an introductory video about yourself, right? And giving space for students to also have those human moments. I think they really need those in the asynchronous environment in particular, but in all, regardless of the modality. Just trying to make sure that that's front and center in your teaching preparation, as well as what are the ways in which you can try to still have those human moments, those organic moments, if you will. It's perhaps comical, the fact that I'm going to ask this question, given that we're doing this via Zoom, but Zoom burnout is a real thing, right? Video conferencing burnout is a real thing. So what tips do you have for helping students, helping yourself avoid Zoom burnout? Or what were maybe some of the guidelines or rules that you had in your courses to sort of meet students where they were?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know if we're, maybe just for ease of things, we'll just follow the same order. One of the things that I was really concerned about was, I was teaching asynchronous classes all last year for CMU, and just, lecturing to little black boxes and having no discussion and no interaction. And so I did a couple of things and I was worried about it. I had 2 capstone classes. Like, how do you do a seminar level, like 500 level seminar capstone class? And I have to say, the one thing that the students told me they really appreciated it was I just really relied heavily on trusting them to use their breakout rooms, right? So for the 2 capstone classes, instead of having and also letting them pick material, because for capstone classes, I had a women and gender studies capstone, and I had a political science capstone. And for me, the goal is for those classes was, can you kind of transform yourself into a junior college and grapple with, with the material in the way that we would do from a disciplinary perspective. And so, I let them pick. I had lists of, I would thread through, the things that we wanted to hit, or, the themes that we wanted to hit. But I had lists of subtopics that sort of in order, and I let the students pick, and they could pick any of the academic books on a particular, scholarly books on a particular topic that they wanted, which I normally would not give up that much control. I would want common reads so that I could make sure that all these points came through. And I was like, they're going to hate that. It's going to feel too much like a lecture. I let them pick what they wanted to read, which helped with their engagement level because they had such a wide variety of things to choose from. And then I just really leaned heavily on breakout rooms, for small group, like, how do you think this connects? Here's some questions. And then we would come back and discuss. I got such high evaluations for that. I mean, it didn't, it felt like I was still trying to shoot for the same things, but I think it worked better sometimes in some ways than even what I had been doing in the classroom. And maybe it was because I was willing to give up control. They were excited. They were talking about things that they were invested in and that they thought were really important. I also didn't micromanage, I would pop through the breakout rooms. I did not micromanage them. If they wanted to spend some time up front, this might be, if they were in quarantine, might be the only time that they had to connect with another human being and have conversation in a way that wasn't structured. So if they wanted to spend a little time sort of checking in with each other, I didn't micromanage that and let them have that time to just, we called it book club. It was book club. And they did great. They had wonderful presentations. They had good critical reviews. I think better papers than I've had with the traditional format in a couple of years. So I really just giving up some of the control and letting them have autonomy and letting them connect with one another was how I handled it in those upper level classes. And then just to pitch, I'm not normally like whatever, you find what technology works for you. In an undergraduate class, it was a flipped class. So I wanted to bring it up because Shu had talked about interest with flipping a class. I had been having trouble flipping a class even before the pandemic, where I'm teaching, I'm calling it Intro to Public Engagement. And so it's some political science material and then applied skills, political science material and then applied skills. And so I wanted to use all the class time for either discussion or applied skills. How do you get them to watch the little video lectures, right? Or how do you get them to do enough reading in advance in a 100 level class? I use Perusall, and I normally do not rave about about software, like whatever. I am a walking advertisement for Perusall. If you haven't used it, I have never had. So it's basically social annotation. You can put your own materials up, you can put videos up, or you can actually have your students purchase a textbook. If they don't have the textbook, get it moved over so that your students can purchase it on the platform really quickly. They have to social annotate on the sides and react to one another. And there's an algorithm that you can change that grades them, but you can actually have them do it on. So like you have your own private YouTube video that has, your little 15 minutes or whatever, 20 minutes of content. They have to annotate it in order to get a grade. And that they watched it to get the grade. In terms of getting them to prep and do the materials in advance is the only thing I've done that made a flipped classroom work. And especially a flipped classroom during the pandemic, where I was, with freshman students, giving them civic skills activities to do, whether it was learning parliamentary procedure or practicing civility or whatever with some prompts. I had to trust them to do it on their own, right? And just let me kind of apparate in and out of their rooms. It would not have worked without Perusall. So big plug for Gary King, I think, helped write that software. So big plug for Gary King's Perusall from my end.
I've heard multiple faculty who use it, who rave about it and love it.
It's amazing. I've never had so many students read.
I need to adopt it. I keep hearing so much about it.
I don't know. So for me, right when the pandemic began, I was at MSU, and as Marty know, my second half of my career at MSU, I was actually doing community engagement. So I didn't teach in a regular classroom setting. I was doing extension work, and so all of our training with local officials had to be moved online because of the pandemic. And it was great in the beginning because, our topic was about how to manage finances in your local community. And that was apparently a very timely, important topic when everything was shut down during the pandemic and local programs received a lot of attendance. So we did that in partnership with either Treasury or other higher ed institutions in the state. Actually, because of its virtual format, we were able to attract more local officials to register for our program. But then I think after a few months, there are more and more organizations who were looking into this topic, and the information becomes sort of redundant, and the Zoom burnout hit, right? So the second half of last year, we didn't have as much attendance, and that actually sort of went downhill from there. So I think my struggle with those programming is because we're trying to hit such a broad audience. We usually have like hundreds of local officials calling in. We couldn't really interact with them. So it was definitely a more one-way lecturing or information sharing type of format. So I was mindful of that, and I was trying to see if I could do things a little differently when I came to EMU, and I am teaching apparently a much smaller class size compared to the hundreds of attendant kind of programming. So breakout rooms is definitely something that I try, and I completely agree with Cherie that it's one of those things that you kind of just have to trust them. You kind of have to just let go and make sure and just know, just believe in them and know that they are carrying it away. The first time I assigned them into a breakout room and I'm the only one in the hallway, I just feel like, oh, I don't know what they're doing. I pop into a few rooms and they were actually doing what they were supposed to do. And I think it also gives them sort of this refreshing break, as if they were actually moving around and talking to people. And I think that's also really important that they get to catch up. I don't even care if they're complaining about my course in their breakout room. If they get to vent, I think that's healthy in a way, right? So another thing that I did is to use the poll on Zoom. So I would, like, the discussion questions that we usually have in an in-person setting, I will put that into a poll survey. And then the classes get to see what their peer students, what their peer classmates have, what are the opinions on this particular issue. So it's somewhat of a interactive little exercise, at least to get them be active by actually have to click through something. So just little, I don't really have much tips for the Zoom burnout. I think it's just inevitable. But then another thing that I also realized is people are sort of accept or even embrace this new normal. And I think it's really here to stay. So maybe eventually we would just get used to it. It would be some sort of social evolution. I think that's some term that I heard the other day. So I don't know.
I've heard some things that are very, very near and dear and familiar to me from both of you. So thank you. I looked at Zoom burnout differently in the very beginning of the pandemic than I kind of did halfway through than I did more recently. And I've always tried to approach interacting with students on a very human level. We've all gone through some stuff, and I thought about what I was doing during the pandemic. And I tend to find a great deal of solace in things like, stories and narratives and uplifting messages. And so I decided that I was going to treat Zoom burnout a great deal like I treat lecture fatigue. And I was going to come in and I was going to plan on the idea that, for 10 or 15 minutes, if I show up with some energy and some kind of vim to what I'm talking about, I can keep you for 10 or 15. But realistically, I need to pivot after that. I need to have the next thing ready. And so I embraced a couple of different ideas that I think have helped most of my students work with this. The first thing is I've been trying to take crucial concepts and push them into either narratives based on current events or narratives that are entirely and sometimes humorously fictional, with the idea of getting them not only talking about it, but sharing their opinion. I completely agree with Shu that the idea of having them in a conversation, right? Having them interacting with their peers, even if it's wildly off topic, right? You give me enough of those conversations where they start to open up and that creates a culture of communication amongst the class, I'll get you back on topic after a while, right? And that's absolutely the same kind of philosophy I went into this with. So yes, breakout rooms, conversations, activities, as many simulations as I could kind of structure within the Zoom environment. And I kind of kept a ticking clock in my head that, somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes, I needed to do something, even if, and that happened on a regular basis, it might still happen before we're done here, even if what I did was grab one of my cats and begin actively petting it on the Zoom screen, right? Because suddenly the eyes were back on me, right? They're like, oh, look at the kitty, right? And yeah, absolutely. That's the idea. And that little bit of a spark and me making a goofy face at the cat or me desperately trying to keep it from showing its unmentionables on the camera was enough sometimes just to kind of remind people, hey, you know what? he's a human being. We're here out of this. And I didn't feel bad about calling a brain break, right? Get up, stretch around. I do the same thing in class. Why does it seem so weird to do it on Zoom, right? Go to the bathroom, get up, move around, do some jumping jacks, whatever, sit back down. I'll see you in 5 minutes. And by incorporating some of that stuff, I absolutely felt like I was getting more out of the class. It kept my energy level up, which I think also helped keep a lot of their energy level up. Sometimes if you set the right stage and you ask an undergraduate tell you what they think, they don't shut up, right? That's the problem, is getting them to not talk for a few minutes. And that was my goal, right? To try to create that kind of a culture in the context of the classroom. And it was not successful in every class or with every student, but it was successful enough that I feel like that environment became something that a lot of the students could look forward to. So that was my series of thoughts.
Thank you. Those were all excellent ideas. I think I just quickly add or just reiterate a little bit of what was said by others, is that we have to be willing to sort of give up control, right, of the classroom a little bit more and let sort of the organic conversations happen, and I affirm breakout rooms and using polls and surveys and simulations and all those things as much as you're able to. And also, I think I found that really sticking to the schedule, if it really was a class, right, for an hour or 45 minutes, really sticking to that, because students, if you go beyond that, you could just sort of see the malaise set in, right? Because there's so much more stimulation happening in an online environment than in a in-person classroom, right? And so research shows that as well. Also, I had a really flexible policy. I know that some faculty sort of that I know had a strict policy about cameras on. I think that's bad advice, right? Because there's issues of sort of inequity and sort of people's comfort level with having their camera on and wherever they are and the environment or background that they are in. So I was very much, look, if you can turn your camera on if you'd like to, but no need to, right? And so just, I think, at times students appreciated that. And now it was hard, as Cherie said, like talking to a bunch of black boxes at times, but that's okay, right? That's where people's comfort level was. And that is totally acceptable, and just acknowledging that with students. So sort of this segues, I think, a little bit to, a question that I've been thinking a lot about, because it's been evident, I think, this last year so much that, and perhaps even more apparent this year and this semester, but a lot of our students are struggling with mental health challenges, and counseling services on campuses are overwhelmed. Students are exhausted, they're unmotivated, depressed, anxious, disengaged. I think even more so this semester than last year. At least that's what I'm seeing. And I think we as faculty were probably feeling the same way, dealing with our own mental health challenges and issues. So what ideas do you have for modifying our curriculum or our expectations or our assessments to sort of meet the current needs of our students and ourselves?
Yeah, this is one of the things that came up in the focus groups we've been doing. So at some point Rebecca and I will, these are just my knee-jerk reactions from summaries from sitting through those, and we'll formalize it and get a PS piece or something out. But things that not just me, but other people have been doing, a pre-semester survey so that your students can check in, what kind of resources do you need? Do you have stable internet? I had a student last fall when I was at CMU, I had a student who I figured out a couple of weeks in was struggling, was, a trans student who wasn't comfortable living at home during the pandemic, lost housing, because it was supposed to live at home and save money, living in his van, taking my class on a smartphone because he did not have money to replace the cord on his laptop, the charger. And so, you find out about those things a couple weeks in, and there are resources for those. But if I had known earlier, if there had been a comfortable way to relay that information, maybe I could have helped faster. Just providing lists of resources on our web, what are the community or campus resources, both for mental health, but also for food and, whatever kinds of things our students asking and being approachable. One person said that she just makes sure to talk about, it was a policy class. So she made sure to talk early in the semester about government programs and mental health issues, right? And so that to make it clear, to normalize that having conversations about that was okay. So a lot of people are doing a lot of different things from a variety of perspectives. The one concern that I have, and this is something I would love if people would help me brainstorm about, is I think we need to do something systematic through our departments, because all of the research shows that the people that wind up doing this emotional labor tend to be women. There was research back, Harry research, Linda Sachs published back in the early, I forget the name of the book, but it was early 2000s, publishing out of the Harry data, that increasing women faculty members increased nurturing, the culture of being nurturing on campus, and the kinds of access to help and assistance that students got went up exponentially the more women were in tenured faculty positions. And the people that got the most help, that benefited the most from having women faculty, were white men, white male students, because they feel comfortable, right, being in a one down position. If relationships between men tend to be more like hierarchical, or competitive, they felt much more, or that they could expect that kind of help from me, that they'll be able to be in a one down position to me and not feel like bad about it or self-conscious about it, or that it's like a normal thing to ask for from a woman. And so that even the students, like who they feel comfortable approaching, are just automatically, because of our socialization, going to turn to women. There was just a piece in PS, right, who was doing, it was actually women without children were doing a lot of the service burden, including the emotional labor for their departments, because women with children were just trying to keep it together, because they were doing all the childcare while they were trying to, they weren't petting their cat while they were teaching. They were like one hand on the kid's head to keep him from bumping into the screen while they're trying to click the breakout button. And so I really think that we need to find ways that institutionalize, right? If it's socialization, if my male colleagues maybe don't always think to present themselves, or aren't socialized to think, oh, I need to make myself, or oh, I need to put this survey in, or oh, I need to make myself accessible. Or if it's coming from the students, I feel more comfortable asking Strachan than I do a man. We need to find ways that those become institutionalized ways of seeking input from our students and helping them, rather than these informal networks, because it is doing serious damage, right, to women's ability to publish, or to have work-life balance. I don't have an answer to that at all. And so if other people have good ideas, I'd be delighted to hear them.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this up. That is, as a women faculty, I could speak to the emotional labor, which I happily provide, but there are times, so I really appreciate and am grateful for the trust that the students place in me, for opening up to me and sharing all these details, all these struggles that they're facing in their personal life. That's a lot of trust that they place in me as a faculty. So I am honored, but it could also be emotionally and time consuming. So my classes for master's students are scheduled at night, and they've gone through. And sometimes I don't go back to my family until almost midnight because of that. And as I said, I'm happy to be available for them, but I also think, even for a standpoint, just sharing a diverse standpoint, a diverse perspective to issues, this is the type of support that we as an institution could use more help, so that students here can hear from different faculty, can be accessible to different type of help or different type of perspectives, viewpoints to the issue. And I think, but going back to how to normalize discussion about mental health, I agree with David that I also take a very personalized or humanizing kind of approach in my teaching and in my interaction with students. Sometimes I talk about, and it also in my personal life, and I would talk about how like last week, I was like 3 minutes late to my class because my 4-year-old son had a balloon related emergency. Let's just leave it at that. So I share that and it's like, I'm sorry I'm late, but I have a little emergency at home and I have students who are firefighters actually. And I said, if you could come to my house and help me put out this metaphorical fire, I would really appreciate that. So I think things like that sort of is humorous, but it also normalizes the fact that we all have lives outside of learning and teaching and our jobs, and we're in this together, and we're really here to support you, guide you through not just education, but also this part of your life that we get to share together. In terms of deadlines, though, I see a lot of faculty on Twitter who would outright say that they would give out extension with no question asked. I am a little unsure if that's the approach I want to take, because for me, I think it's still useful and important for anyone to have a structure to follow. I think that could be motivating in a way. So I would still have a deadline of some sort in my syllabus, but I don't implement that as strictly as I lay out in the syllabus. So I would have 2 weeks that I schedule as a flex week so that they can catch up with the assignments. And if they come to me and say, I just need some extra days, I would provide that accommodation with no points taken off. So it's more of a implicit, informal kind of accommodation while there's still some structure. But I do know that there are other approaches to this, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and your practices related to this in general with this kind of accommodation in the pandemic.
Yeah, this is one of those topics where my desire to help and my desire to try to be a resource for students runs into my knowledge that I am not a trained mental health professional, right? And that I can probably relate to a student as another human being and try to, make myself emotionally and personally available, but I cannot take upon myself their treatment. I am unqualified, I am incapable, and realistically, I'm not there for them like a professional would or should be. Part of that comes out of the fact that the social and behavioral sciences department at Ferris, in which political science is located, is basically informally, realistically referred to as psychology and friends, right? Because there's like 9 tenure track psychologists and then a few of the rest of us in geography, sociology, and political science. So I get a lot of that on the hall and in department meetings, and I see it and I believe it, right? So I think in terms of mental health, I try to, one, make sure that the resources available from the university and the community are readily and easily accessible, both in my syllabus and on my course shells and through me at any point in time. I try to engage with students like human beings. I've used frequently the phrase, let me take my professor hat off here for a moment and talk to you, right? And it's just a way of acknowledging the fact that, we have roles we play in this scenario, and that outside of those roles, we can maybe have a slightly different conversation, right? But eventually I have to put that hat back on, and that helps to kind of establish that line. Next, though, I think in terms of what I'm structuring in the course and things like deadlines, like she was mentioning, yeah, my deadlines are pretty much the same as they have always been. And I know full well that there's a tremendous amount of flexibility behind the scenes, right? I communicate to my students more explicitly than I ever have the idea that, meeting deadlines is important, moving through this material is important, if only because we need to get through all of this. And if you neglect this, then everything starts falling off the back of the cart, right? So I need you to kind of stay current and move with these things. That said, we're currently all experiencing an unprecedented global pandemic, and we're all dealing with things that we've never dealt with as human beings before. So if you come to me, I am happy to try to make some allowances for you, as long as you're making a good faith effort to do what you're here to do, and that is learn this, right? And it has made me take a lot of really hard looks at what things am I using in the classroom in terms of assessments that are there because I think it checks a box, and how many of them are there because I think it actually helps develop learning. One of the things I started doing just around the pandemic, but really had started playing with beforehand, is using a series of quizzes due each week, not capable of being completed beyond it, but with the absolute knowledge that the students will use their course materials to complete the quiz, right? And I tell them out front, do the first one without any, looking at your text. But if you don't like your score, take it again. You can take it as many times as you want. At the end of the week, whatever you get is what you get. And I'll tell you right now, the exam for this part at the end of it's going to look a lot the same. What do they do? Well, they read the stuff, right? I don't even know if they read it and then they take the quiz, or they just open up the book and go through the questions and find everything. But the point is they read it, right? And I'm okay with that because it gets them to read it, right? And they retain the material. And sometimes I've even used the exact same questions on the exam at the end, just amalgamized. And they're like, oh, I read all this. Yeah, but now you got to go back through and review it all, right? And that's the whole point. So understanding what maybe they're in a position to walk away with at a time like this, and how I can give them things that they're going to retain, as opposed to things that, or activities that I think is important or that I was taught, the way we all came through an undergraduate education. That flexibility and humanity has been my combination there. And also, I think, again, doubling down on the humility thing I mentioned earlier, just understanding I'm not a therapist, right? And I am not necessarily afraid of putting myself in a position where I am accidentally expected to be one, but I'm aware that's a possibility. And I want to make sure that they're getting help that they need. And that's probably not from a random political scientist. So
those are all excellent suggestions. And I totally echo the need to sort of normalize counseling and therapy, right? So like I frequently encourage my students, I put it in my syllabus, right, where they can get counseling and therapy resources via the university, and several times throughout the semester, especially when I can sort of tell that students are feeling discouraged. I sort of send it back out to everyone, right? So that they know, and just normalizing it, encouraging students to utilize those resources. I totally agree with Cherie and Shu's comments about the overburden on our female colleagues who are frequently doing the emotional support of our students. And that means that all of us with gender privilege need to step up and sort of make sure that students are able to come to us too, right? And feel like they can, and try to be as approachable as we can be, so that they feel like they can access our needs, but without, trying to play pseudo therapist, right? When we're not, but at least just, letting them know that our doors open as well. I would say, yeah, we all have sort of different perspectives on when strict deadlines are or not, and our flexibility. I think, we've all said that, being flexible is critical. I do something that I've always done even pre-pandemic, but I've continued, is I always have a 24-hour grace period. And so there is the deadline, but you have 24 hours to submit it after that without penalty. And then if you get that 1 minute late, even flexible on that, but I tell them if it's 1 minute late, then you get a 25% penalty. And then for every 24-hour period after that, it goes down. So basically 4 days late, you're going to get a 0. Now, in extreme circumstances, if someone, says I'll make exceptions to that, but they know that right off the gate that there is some flexibility. So if they're having a really bad week, right, that they still have some time to sort of play catch up. I also tend to drop students' worst scores on things. So if they have, if I do 8 problem sets, I'll just grade them on the best 7. Or if I do 10 quizzes throughout the semester, it'll just be the best 9, right? So they know that they have a bad week, that it's not going to be the worst result for them. Also for tests, I used to do, even in-person courses, I used to sort of do them in class. No longer. I basically say, look, this will be a 24-hour period where you can take the test online. You can open it up at any point that you want. And then you have 2 hours or an hour, whatever the time frame is, to take it and then submit it. But you can do that at any point throughout this day. Because I used to always get students who would say, oh, I got sick before the exam, or oh, I can't take it today, or that way it gives them so much flexibility about when they're able to have good internet connection, when they can take it. And you might fear cheating and things like that, but if you do enough applied questions, it's really hard for students to sort of cheat, right? You also can sort of compare scores in essay written exams across students, at least in our sort of Blackboard. We can do that. All right, great comments. I also just sort of want to recognize, right, the high profile senseless deaths of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many other people of color, especially Black Americans, at the hands of police and vigilantes, along with sort of frequently occurring incidents of racial injustice and inequity, as well as the backlash to these critical social justice movements that have been happening. All of this has sort of perpetuated further harm against and trauma for our students, as well as our faculty, our colleagues of color. And so I was just, hoping to have a little bit of a conversation about the ideas that you might have to better support our students and colleagues of color in and outside the classroom, and try to continue to, raise awareness about systemic racism, inequality, and oppression in our society via the curriculum that we design for our students.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we have to do, one of the most important things we can do is to diversify our faculty. And we've been talking about that for a really long time, and I don't think that we've been, very successful institutionally writ large or in political science, right? We still have leaky pipelines, and probably the leakiest pipeline is for women of color. And so those are some big structural things that we have to figure out how we are failing and how we're dropping the ball, and not why there's a leaky pipeline in graduate school, why there's a leaky pipeline to tenure, why do so many women of color wind up in adjunct and fixed term positions instead of tenured professors. Some of that are the things that we've already been talking about who gets, who gets winds up doing all the service, or if you have a child or are a caregiver, how does that affect how people react or interact with you? What are the implicit bias? I just don't know. I know we've been talking about those things for a long time, but the proof is in the numbers and the numbers aren't there. So if we really care that we have, that our students have someone who they feel will empathize and understand what they're going through, it would help if we could just start by having some symbolic representation among the faculty. I'm not sure that I know the answers for how to get there. I just know we haven't done it yet. Other things, check your syllabus, right? We have all kinds of syllabus checkers now, right? Where you can check and make sure that your syllabi has people from different genders and ethnicities represented in who we all know the Rolodex trick, right? Like you're putting through your syllabus together. If most political scientists are white men still, you think of who you think, right? Oh, I can put this reading in, or, oh, I can have this assignment. And you're thinking through the people who you interact with and who which, we tend to flock together demographically, even in our profession. So just checking yourself, making sure to try to balance and integrate topics, acknowledging, if there's a place in your syllabus, do an intro to American or an intro to public policy class, if there's a place where there's a natural connection to talk about these things, whether it's a current event or an ongoing equity-based, right, public policy issue, do it. Bring it in so that it's not just siphoned off and siloed off in that women in politics class. And I don't think that we can any longer, I did this in a keynote. I don't know if anyone was there for TLC right before the pandemic, where I talked about intersectional civic engagement pedagogy. Why would you think we can't teach the same way for all students? And as many of us are behavioralists who build a regression model and put all of those demographic variables in as controls, because we know that people's lived experiences affect how they respond to political stimuli and experiences. learning experiences are the same, right? And so people are going to react and learn differently, or react to content, or react to the same activity in the classroom differently. Those were all designed the way that we approach pedagogy historically, like any other institution in the United States, were designed for white male students. That's just where we came from. So that's probably, I haven't done the research, but for most of it, that's probably who the approaches that we currently use probably work best for them. And so we probably need to rethink intersectionality in terms of how students are going to receive different learning experiences, receive different, especially when you're doing civic and political engagement activities, we'll need different skills to participate fully. We'll need different conversations to feel comfortable in the public sphere. And we have to step up and start thinking about that and study. And as a right, on the editorial team for the Journal of Political Science Education, and studying it so that you can send us good manuscripts. Because, that's where we need to across the board, need to step up. Good question. I don't know that I have great answers, but we need to pay attention to it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Cherie. It's when Marty first asked me to join this roundtable, I told him that I don't know if I have good tips to share, and I'm really mostly here to learn. And this is one among many things that I learned out of today. There are so many. There's actually teaching technique, but pedagogy involved about this. How related to how we go about this issue, not just this issue as a lecture topic, but how we go about our teaching practice while embracing the idea that if we embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to reflect that not just in our faculty, but also in our daily teaching. How do we think about or go about our teaching business by incorporating different techniques that speak to different audiences? So thank you so much for bringing that up. I will want to look into that and see how I can improve my teaching through that. So for me, I teach public policy and public administration. So my topic is really closely related to these social movement, these social justice issues. I would feel like I fail the student if I don't talk about those topics in my lectures. So for me, my course prep is always evolving, incorporating the issues that are happening in our society. So I always tell my students that I don't shy away from sensitive topics. We even talk about defunding police, which I know could be sensitive and radical to some of my students, especially some of them are first-line public safety officers. But I still want to address that. I want us to have a organic, healthy conversation. I want the students to hear from different sides and to learn about how to approach this issue, how different viewpoints, how to examine this issue from different perspectives. And also, I think that's a useful life skill to have. How do you talk about a challenging, sensitive, difficult topic with people who may hold different opinions? I think for political science students, that's just a very useful skill to have. And of course, I will guide them through and facilitate the conversation and make sure that people are remaining respectful and courteous throughout the process. So that's that has been my experience. For me, something that I struggle with at the beginning was earlier this year, I think in the past year, there's increased hate crimes against Asian Americans. And I want to talk about that for obvious reasons, both professional and personal. But I also don't want people or students to feel I am one of those all life matters by taking the attention away from other pressing issues that we need to address as a society. And eventually I came out of that by thinking, no, why am I thinking about that? That is a wrong mindset. We shouldn't pitch one minority group against each other as if we were fighting for attention. We're all in this together, right? And it's only when we can come together, we can push this forward. We're stronger together. So that has been a message that I start incorporating into my lecture as well. So when I talk about diversity, equity issues, of course, African-American, Black communities would be a focus, but I would also encourage the students to think about underprivileged group or unique challenges faced by different racial, ethnic, or culturally minority groups together, and think about the commonalities and the uniqueness and how we can sort of build alliance and push for changes in the future.
So let's not mess around. This one's hard, right? I come at this as a person who spent no small portion of my afternoon trying not to chew through my couch after seeing the Rittenhouse verdicts. And I think that acknowledging that, as frequently as political scientists, especially dealing with undergraduates, part of what we're doing is helping students understand the structures of power that exist around them in numerous different ways, right? But those structures also exist within a human reality. And taking the time to acknowledge that that human reality can sometimes violate the core principles inherent in those structures and make us feel really awful at the same time is a true thing, right? There are historical precedents and events that demonstrate this is not a new phenomenon. And I always feel like sometimes I am dangerously close to either ignoring it completely or pretending it's kind of a Pollyanna thing that we can all solve through democracy, right? And I think that being able to talk about these things, not only again as a person, but in the context of reality, yes, these are the systems that should have prevented this, and this is why they didn't work, or this is how they failed, and this is why they may continue to fail. And then hopefully at some point in time at the end of that, being able to say, and this is how we might change that, right? Presenting both the historical and the societal context around these things, right? Not shying away from dealing honestly with controversy, and understanding that we, each of us, have a voice and a role and some authority in the front of the classroom, not to indoctrinate, but to do what we are kind of professionally obligated to do, and that is show what is real and supported by facts and evidence and what is not, right? And I think a lot of times, especially in issues like this, that would seem to give us a political inclination one way or the other. And I think you have to say that part out loud, right? You don't shy away from the idea of saying that, me saying this to you right now might be giving you the impression I am taking a side, right? But this is where I have arrived at this information. Here are the sources from which I am drawing, and here's why I believe those sources to be credible. And my concern is that anything less than that makes you another talking head in a world that tries to find ways to justify some things that really aren't that justifiable, right? Whether that is whether that is someone screaming at a person of a particular ethnic descent because leaders are using horrible racist terminology to describe the pandemic, or whether that is an African-American student sitting in your classroom next to a criminal justice major who wonders if the camaraderie they're feeling because of some group work that they did here will survive 5 years from now, right? Students are experiencing not only these current events nationally, but the thing I always kind of keep in the back of my head is they're also experiencing the reactions of people in their immediate lives to these events nationally, right? And they're adults, they're 18, sure, but they're adults in a lot of really important ways. And if I try to hide behind pedagogy, or if I try to gloss it over, if I try to pretend like it's not something I should be talking about because this is an urban and regional planning class as opposed to an American government class, right? I feel like I'm doing them a misservice. So I feel like sometimes you gotta lean into it, and you gotta trust in the same standards we set for ourselves professionally and the same decency we would hold to ourselves societally, and just be that person in front of the students.
Yeah, thank you so much. I affirm all the comments that were shared, and these are challenging conversations to have with students, but I am of the firm belief that they are so important and we have to have those conversations. And I think, as Cherie pointed out before, we can't leave them to classes on like women in politics or minority politics. No, like, as someone who identifies as white, like, it's my responsibility to have these conversations with students because I have that racial and ethnic privilege, and I should be sort of leading these conversations and sort of, you know, helping students navigate these topics. And so I always used to include, you know, components around historic systemic racism in my coursework, but it was never explicit enough. And sort of I have changed. I now have modules on it. And for example, even my internship course, I have them think about and read about intersectionality. I have a privilege quiz I have them take. I have them sort of talk about their identities. I model that for them. I do that, you know, myself first, and then they sort of watch that, and then they can sort of write on it. I have them think about biases, implicit bias. So I have them take multiple Harvard implicit bias. You know, we could talk about how good those are or not, but just getting them to think about privilege, intersectionality, identity, bias, implicit and explicit, and then sort of writing about that, and then saying, okay, how do you interact with your supervisor who may share some of your same identities or different identities? Now, how do you interact with someone who you might be serving as a constituent or in the public that has different identities than you, right? So getting them to think about that. And, you know, it's an asynchronous class, so students don't always engage with one another, which is a good thing. And so that leads to conversations that I have to then have with students and with their essays. But by and large, students take it seriously, and I think thoroughly enjoy it and benefit from it. And many students write in their essay, I am so glad I had this opportunity to tackle these topics. So anyway, I think you're right. We have to continue doing it. We are, 15 minutes past what I promised we'd be, but I just want to open it up. I'll stop talking. I want to open it up for other questions from audience members, and apologies.
Hi, I don't really have a question. It's goes back to one of the questions that Shu asked in the beginning about flipping a classroom, and what kind of goes into that. I don't know how long many of you have been teaching online. We at GRCC, I've been teaching online for 19 years. So flipping a classroom really isn't new to me. A lot of the technology and Cherie, what you were talking about regarding intellectual property law and recording, trying to integrate other videos so that you don't share too much of your own. We are seeing an uptick, as I'm sure you all are, and what our college is now calling quote unquote hardened perspectives in our classrooms. And, our college has taken a real holistic approach to food insecurity, housing insecurity, and mental health issues and whatnot. I would say one of the things that I'm most proud of about GRCC is our ability to reach out to marginalized groups. So if you're looking at resources or even something to kind of maybe spearhead something at your own college, is grcc.edu/get help. That's all it is. And we provide healthcare resources for students. We provide emergency funding. We even have laptop vending machines on our campus. Yeah. We have our own food pantry where students actually go in with a basket and shop like you normally would. We were one of 47 colleges chosen throughout the United States and only 3 in Michigan for our outreach in reaching those students who are hungry. And I can share some of that information, but I just think that it's important to understand when you are flipping the classroom and you are doing those things, you are taking into consideration that those marginalized students might not be able to meet the needs. So Cherie, you were talking about a student who was taking your online class with, with a phone because they didn't have cord resources or money to buy a cord. For many years, I've heard about homeless students and we all have trafficked students in our classrooms, whether we want to know it or not, or acknowledge or not, it's there. And flipping the classroom is a great idea. Shu, if you want to reach out, I can speak to you specifically about this, but I think this is just a more broad approach that I think we're all hitting on the mental health issue that our students are facing. And I agree, David, with what you said about being more transparent. And Shu, even with you being more transparent about, hey, my kid had a meltdown today and, or set my house on fire. Or for me, it was my kid had a concussion and this was our first experience with a concussion. And students are much more willing to open up to you if they see you as more human, which again, yes, I would agree with all of your feedback about being a female makes you more approachable. You do tend to get a lot of the more emotional dump from students. And that's really hard to regulate. But it's also really important to know what the resources are that the college offers. And we have a syllabus template at GRCC that all faculty who offer classes have to use the syllabus template, and it is accessible, ADA accessible. And if you don't use it, you don't get classes. So it's not a guiding hand, it's a requirement. And it lists all the policies, and every 3 years we reevaluate it and update it. And it includes references to all of the latest thing that we are adding is protocol. If there's a grievance with your grade, or what are the steps that need to happen? It first needs to go to the professor. You can't go straight to the provost. That's not how this works. And so having a consistent syllabus across the board, we found that it eliminates a lot of challenges and a lot of questions that students have. And so those are some of the things, and I was listening the whole time, and those were some of the things that I kind of kicked around and thought. I like your idea, Cherie, about having them provide a summary of what they did read or what the assessment was about. We are leaving Camtasia because they're no longer doing the video. We are using Panopto now, which is just great. We get to learn new video things like every year. It's so awesome. I'm so glad when they do this. But we can embed questions within the videos and a mashup, and it automatically throws the answers into Blackboard for us. So in order to continue, they have to complete the questions in order to continue the video, and they only get the questions if they watch the video. So I do think that there are a lot of technological advances that would benefit those of you who might be just treading into teaching online. The other thing, we have post-pandemic, which is what this whole thing is about. We are keeping our virtual modality. So when we went from 80% face-to-face to 20% online pre-pandemic, we are now at 80% online and 20% face-to-face. we are doing our year-round schedule, and by next fall, we are going to pre-pandemic levels. And they want us to be responsive to what the students need. And what we are finding is that students really want more online classes. And we added a new modality, and that's virtual. So that's a synchronous online modality, and that's staying in our curriculum. And it's remarkably useful, Cherie, you said, to keep those modalities for introductory classes, especially if you're going to be across the board. I teach a constitutional foundations class. I only offer it once a year. I offered it virtually, and I had a student from Colorado in my class, and he was one of the best. He was at Colorado State, and he was just looking for more online classes during COVID. So I do think that there's data to support that this is what students want. So that, and the last thing, David and Cherie, you spoke about is diversifying the videos. I have found TED Talks. I think everybody knows Jonathan Dr. Haidt's The Moral Roots of Liberals and Conservatives, which is one of the top 10 TED Talks of all time. I would highly recommend. And I use the Khan Academy, which you'd be surprised, but the Wacom tablet that he uses in that, where he can spell it out and write it out. And he also, the two authors really around political science, they also bring in experts, constitutional law experts, to be part of their videos. And what's great about those Khan Academy videos is you can diversify. And so students aren't just listening to your voice alone. They'll have, and I break it up where it's about separation of powers. This one is 8 minutes. And so they can just get pieces, and they don't have to listen to one person all the time. And so when I do pop a video in, they're like, this is stuff that's so important that it's not in other videos, or she doesn't like the way that it's presented in other videos. That means it's really important and I should watch it. So
awesome. Thank you,
that's my
Heather. Thank you
overall
for those
response.
additional comments and suggestions. Those were helpful. I'll go ahead and wrap us. We'll close this up. If others are able to stick around, fantastic. If you're not, totally understandable. Thank you so much to our panelists. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you and how much I learned today. Thank you to our audience members, for those who were able to be here. Thanks to those who were able to stick around as well. So good to see you. And thanks for another successful Michigan Political Science Association conference. Looking forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person next year.